Life often teaches lessons in unexpected ways. For me, the most striking lesson came in the form of a letter. Not an ordinary letter, not a greeting card or a note of congratulations. This was something that challenged the very foundation of my self-worth. I had always assumed that life measured us through our choices, our efforts, and the love we gave. Yet, this letter reduced decades of living into a numerical judgment. At first, I could not believe it. I read the words again and again, trying to understand if it was a joke, a mistake, or some cruel prank. But the signature at the bottom left no room for doubt. It was from my mother. The letter outlined everything that, according to her, I had cost her emotionally, financially, and socially. Each failure, each mistake, every decision that deviated from her expectations was quantified and totaled. The sheer scale of the number was staggering. For hours, I sat trying to digest the meaning behind it. Was I truly a failure? Had every effort, every attempt, every dream I had pursued been meaningless in her eyes? These thoughts spiraled through my mind, leaving a sense of emptiness I had never experienced before. Reflecting on my childhood, I realized that my perception of failure had been shaped subtly, gradually. Each minor reprimand, each disappointed sigh, every unspoken expectation had left an imprint. This letter was merely a crystallization of years of cumulative judgment. The absurdity of it did not make it less painful. I questioned whether it was possible to carry the burden of familial expectations while still maintaining a sense of self-worth. Could anyone survive this without internalizing it as truth? My reflections were interrupted not by action, but by memory. I thought of my early years, the challenges I'd faced, the efforts I had made, the small victories I had achieved that seemed insignificant to others but monumental to me. The letter seemed to disregard all of this, focusing solely on what had gone wrong according to her standards. It was during these reflections that I began to confront a harsh truth. My mother had never truly communicated love without expectation. Love had been conditional, measured by success, compliance, and perfection. My perception of her care had always been intertwined with obligation, and the letter simply formalized what I had subconsciously felt for years. I questioned myself constantly. Was I not trying hard enough? Was my ambition insufficient? Had my failures truly accumulated into this enormous debt? The internal dialogue became relentless, exhausting, and unending. Yet, amid the turmoil, a quiet voice in my mind reminded me that identity cannot be reduced to judgment, especially not by another person. I had always believed that self-worth came from within, but this letter forced me to confront whether I truly accepted that belief. As I pondered, I also considered the origins of my mother's perspective. I realized that her life had been defined by struggle, scarcity, and hardship. She had grown up in an environment where mistakes were costly, not just emotionally, but materially and socially. Her worldview was shaped by survival, by fear of inadequacy, and by relentless expectations imposed upon her by her own family. Understanding this did not erase the hurt, but it began to offer context. Her letter, though cruel in presentation, was a reflection of a lifetime of conditioned behavior, not a definitive statement about my value. It was a revelation that the standards imposed upon me were not solely mine to bear. They were inherited burdens she had carried and now projected onto me. This realization began the slow process of reframing Perhaps failure is not an absolute
नबी
measure.
करीम
The
मोहम्मद
perspective
मुस्तफ़ा
colored by
सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि
fear,
वसल्लम इंसानियत के सबसे
expectation,
बड़े मुहसिन
and unresolved pain.
और अल्लाह जल्ल
Perhaps
शानहू
my
की
life
जानिब
could be
से
seen
ये
differently
हुक्म है
if I
कि जो
chose
लोग
to
अल्लाह ताला
interpret
से
my
मोहब्बत करते हैं वो
experiences
नबी
through
करीम
the lens of
सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि
growth
वसल्लम की
rather
इताअत
than
करें।
deficit. During
इताअत
this
करने
period
के
of
लिए
reflection,
शख्सियत से
I felt an
वाकफियत,
emerging
मार्फत,
need
उनकी
to seek
मोहब्बत,
guidance,
उनकी कद्र व
someone
कीमत,
whose
उनकी
perspective
मंज़लत
could
जितनी
balance
ज़्यादा
my
दिल
own
में होगी,
turbulent emotions.
उतनी
My
इताअत करना
grandmother
आसान
had
है। सहाबा
always
किराम
been a
रिज़वानुल्लाहि
source of
ताला
wisdom,
अलैहिम अजमईन
a
को
person who
इताअत के
seemed
ये
to
ऊंचे तरीन
understand
दर्जात
life's
जो नसीब हुए
complexities
वो इस
without
वजह से कि वो
resorting to
हुजूर अकरम
judgment.
सल्लल्लाहु
Her
अलैहि वसल्लम से
presence,
बहुत वाकिफ
even
थे,
in thought,
बहुत सारे
provided
वाक़यात
comfort.
की वो ऐनी
I
शाहिद
considered
थे।
her approach.
रसूलुल्लाह
She had
सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि
navigated
वसल्लम की रात
life's
और दिन उनके
challenges with
सामने थे।
resilience,
आपकी ग़ज़वात,
without
आपकी
assigning
मुजाहदात,
blame
आपकी
unnecessarily,
मुश्किलात,
and
आपने
she
जितनी
often
भी
focused
दीन
on
के लिए जितनी
understanding
परेशानियां
human
उठाई वो
behavior
उस
rather
सब को
than reacting to it
हज़रात सहाबा
impulsively.
अपनी आंखों
I
से देख रहे
realized that I
थे
could
और यही
benefit from
देखना
adopting a
जानना
similar
उनकी
mindset,
मोहब्बत की बुनियाद
viewing
बना
the letter
और यही
not as a
मोहब्बत उनकी
condemnation,
इताअत की बुनियाद
but as a
बना।
starting point
आज
for
अगर
reflection,
हमें रसूलुल्लाह
learning,
सल्लल्लाहु
and
अलैहि वसल्लम की
self-assessment.
इताअत में
Through this
अगर
lens,
हमारी
I
कमी है
began to
या हम
analyze my own
नाकाम
life
हैं इस
decisions.
इम्तिहान में,
I
उसकी
cataloged
वजह
not
उसकी वजूहात
failures,
में
but
से एक बहुत
lessons
बड़ी वजह
learned.
ये है
Each
कि हमें
perceived
हुजूर
mistake
अकरम
revealed
सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि
growth,
वसल्लम का पूरा तारुफ
resilience,
नहीं है।
and
हमने
adaptation.
आपकी ज़िंदगी
Each
को पढ़ा
moment
नहीं
of
है, आपकी
difficulty
जद्दोजहद
offered
से हम
insight
वाकिफ नहीं
into
हैं,
human behavior,
आपके शब व रोज़ का
patience,
हमें इल्म
and
नहीं है।
perseverance.
सीरत
Gradually,
रसूल
the letter's
सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि
sting
वसल्लम
softened
नबी
as I
करीम सल्लल्लाहु
reframed
अलैहि
its
वसल्लम
meaning.
के इस
Not a
तारुफ का
verdict,
नाम है,
but an
आपसे वाकफियत
invitation
का
to
नाम है,
understand.
आपकी ज़िंदगी
I
के
also
तमाम
considered
गोशों
the
से
broader
अपने आप को
implications
बाखबर
of
करने
the
का नाम
moral
है।
judgment.
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह अल
It
बुरहान
became
के ज़ेर
clear that
एहतमाम
many of our
पूरे मुल्क
conflicts
में, मुल्क के
stem
तूल व अर्ज़
not
में
from
और
malice,
पाकिस्तान
but
से
from
बाहर
unspoken
सीरत सर्कल्स के नाम
expectations,
से
historical
हल्का हाय
conditioning,
सीरत का
and
इनेकाद
intergenerational
किया जाता
pressures.
है।
The
इसमें
letter, absurd
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह
as it
सैकड़ों
seemed,
लोग इस
symbolized
वक्त
the
पूरे मुल्क
culmination
में
of these
जगह
forces
जगह सीरत
rather
के
than
छोटे
a
छोटे
unique
हल्के लगाते हैं।
condemnation.
तो हफ्ते में
Through
सिर्फ 2
reflection,
घंटे देकर
I began to
इतने
recognize
आज़िमुशान
patterns
मकसद
in
को
my
अगर
life.
हासिल कर लिया जाए
Moments
कि
where I
हमें हुजूर अकरम
internalized
सल्लल्लाहु
external
अलैहि वसल्लम
judgment
का तारुफ हो जाए,
unnecessarily.
आपकी मेहनत
Times when I
मालूम हो जाए,
allowed
आपकी
fear of
जद्दोजहद,
disapproval to
आपकी
dictate
मशक्क़तें
my
और आपने
choices.
जो आजमाइशें
In
उठाई
instances
हैं
where I
और आपका जो
undervalued my
हदफ
worth.
ज़िंदगी गुजारने का
By
जो
identifying these
मनसब
patterns,
नबूवत
I
का
could
जिस
reclaim
तरीके के साथ आपने
agency
हक़
over
अदा
my
किया
emotional
उसकी
response,
तफसीलात से अगर हम
separating
वाकिफ़ हो
external
जाएं
judgment
तो ये
from
हमारी
personal
ज़िंदगी पर
growth.
बहुत
This
बड़ा
mental
असर डाल देगी,
exercise,
हमारे
although
आमाल पर बहुत
abstract,
बड़ा
was
असर
transformative.
पड़
I
जाएगा।
realized
शायद
that the
हम
letter's
जो अभी तक एक
greatest
बेमकसद ज़िंदगी
impact
गुजार रहे
was not
हैं वो
financial
एक
or
बामकसद
punitive.
ज़िंदगी में
It was psychological.
कन्वर्ट हो
And
जाए
by
हमारी ज़िंदगी,
approaching it
तब्दील हो जाए
reflectively,
हमारी ज़िंदगी।
I could convert its negative energy into a source of self-awareness and empowerment. I continued to explore the emotional impact of the letter. It was not merely disappointment that weighed on me, but a profound questioning of identity. I asked myself, who am I beyond parental expectations? What is my measure of success if not validated externally? What does it mean to live authentically in a world that often assigns worth superficially? These questions became central to my introspection. I began journaling, documenting my thoughts, and engaging in sustained reflection. I noticed subtle shifts in my perception. Instead of feeling diminished by the letter, I began to see it as an opportunity to define myself independently of inherited expectations. By the end of this period of intense reflection, I recognized an essential truth. My value was inherent, not conferred by others. External judgments, however formalized or punitive, could not diminish the core of my being. The days following the arrival of the $347,000 letter were filled with an unusual kind of silence. The letter was gone, or rather, burned in thought and memory, yet its impact lingered. The number, the judgment, the accusation, it hovered over me like a shadow, not tangible, not visible, yet profoundly present. I found myself questioning everything, not just my actions or my accomplishments, but the very essence of who I was. Was my life merely a series of mistakes to be quantified and judged? Was my worth dependent on another's perception, or could it exist independently, intrinsic and untouchable? These thoughts did not arise as fleeting reflections. They were persistent, insistent. Each day, I revisited moments of my childhood, analyzing them with a new lens of scrutiny. I recalled times when I felt inadequate in my mother's eyes, the minor errors that had been amplified, the achievements that had gone unnoticed, the small rebellions that had been interpreted as failures. Reflection is not always gentle. Sometimes it demands confrontation with truths that are uncomfortable, even painful. I began to see patterns in my life, moments where I had sought approval instead of fulfillment, where fear of judgment had dictated choices, where I had measured my success against the expectations of others rather than the reality of my own growth. The letter, absurd as it was, had catalyzed this process. It forced me to confront the deepest questions I had avoided. What does it mean to be a failure? Who determines the value of a life? Can one recover from the perception of inadequacy imposed by those closest to us. I realized that much of my suffering had stemmed from internalizing external judgments. My mother's expectations, rigid and unyielding, had become a lens through which I viewed my own abilities. This letter, in quantifying every supposed failure, crystallized a narrative I had subconsciously accepted for years. As I reflected, I began to differentiate between intent and impact. My mother's judgment, harsh as it appeared, was not necessarily born from malice. It was rooted in her experiences, her upbringing, her own fears, and the pressure she had internalized from her parents and society. I began to see that parental judgment often reflects generational patterns rather than individual shortcomings. Expectations, when unexamined, become burdens that are passed down, a chain of pressure that links parent and child in a cycle of anxiety and unmet standards. This perspective did not erase the pain of the letter, but it offered a framework for understanding. Instead of seeing myself as a failure, I began to see the situation as a reflection of my mother's struggles, magnified and misapplied, rather than a definitive statement about my worth. The letter sparked an intense period of emotional turmoil. I questioned my choices, my motivations, my achievements, and even my intentions. Every success felt diminished, every misstep amplified. The emotional landscape of these days was complex, a mixture of anger, grief, confusion, and a faint glimmer of clarity that refused to fully emerge. I often revisited the idea of identity. Who was I, beyond the labels imposed by others? Could I claim autonomy over my self-perception, or was it always mediated by the approval and disapproval of family and society? Through journaling and reflection, I started to separate the layers of influence, distinguishing between external judgment and internal self-concept. I realized that much of the distress I felt was not directly caused by the letter itself, but by years of accumulated expectations that I had internalized. Reflection alone is insufficient without critical thinking. I began analyzing my own behaviors, questioning why certain events had impacted me so profoundly. I noticed patterns, tendencies to self-doubt, to seek validation externally, to overemphasize perceived failures while minimizing accomplishments. Recognizing these patterns was not an exercise in self-blame, but in self-understanding. I began to cultivate a mental space in which my self-worth was defined independently of parental judgment. I reminded myself that human development is a process, that growth occurs through failure and adaptation, and that mistakes are not markers of inherent inadequacy. Part of this period of introspection involved a deeper analysis of family dynamics. I reflected on the broader context of my mother's behavior, her upbringing, her challenges, her experiences with scarcity and pressure. These reflections led to an understanding that her expectations, while extreme, were a product of her environment and conditioning. By examining the family context, I began to cultivate empathy. This did not excuse hurtful actions, nor did it diminish the impact of the letter, but it provided a framework for interpreting behavior without internalizing it as a reflection of personal inadequacy. I also consider my own responses within the family system. Where had I allowed external judgment to dictate my self-esteem? Where had I absorbed messages of inadequacy that were never truly my responsibility? Identifying these patterns was both liberating and challenging. Perspective became central to this period of growth. By reframing the letter as a reflection of systemic family dynamics, rather than an absolute judgment, I was able to create distance from its immediate emotional impact. I began to understand that worth is not a function of perceived failures or successes in the eyes of others. Instead, it is a measure of resilience, self-awareness, adaptability, and the capacity to learn from experience. After weeks of deep reflection and guidance, I began to notice subtle shifts in my inner world. The initial shock of the $347,000 letter had evolved into something more profound, a journey of understanding myself, my mother, and the intergenerational patterns that had long influenced our lives. What had begun as confusion and emotional turmoil was slowly transforming into clarity, perspective, and the first stages of healing. Healing, I realized, was not a sudden occurrence, but a gradual process. It required patience, self-reflection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths without judgment. The insights I had gained from my grandmother provided a framework, but it was up to me to internalize these lessons and integrate them into my life. One of the most important lessons during this phase was redefining self-worth. I had long measured my value according to external validation, praise from authority figures, approval from my mother, or recognition from peers. The letter forced me to confront the limitations of this approach. I began to see that true self-worth is internal and independent of external judgment. Mistakes, failures, and unmet expectations do not diminish inherent value. This realization required conscious effort to internalize, as decades of conditioned thinking had taught me otherwise. I started practicing self-reflection in a structured way, noting achievements without minimizing them, acknowledging effort without overemphasizing flaws, and framing challenges as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of inadequacy. Over time, these practices nurtured a sense of intrinsic self-worth that was no longer contingent on parental or societal approval. Another crucial insight involved separating judgment from reality. The letter had quantified my perceived failures in a way that felt tangible, yet did not reflect the reality of my life, my accomplishments, or my growth. I began to differentiate between my mother's perceptions, shaped by her fears, experiences, and expectations, and my own reality. This process required mental discipline. Whenever a thought emerged rooted in external judgment, I paused, analyzed its origin, and consciously reframed it. I reminded myself that external judgments are limited and often incomplete, while my lived experiences, resilience, and personal values constitute the true measure of my life. Healing also involves setting mental and emotional boundaries. I realized that while family insights are valuable, internalizing every critique or expectation can be damaging. Boundaries allowed me to engage with family history and patterns without absorbing the emotional weight of judgment. I practiced recognizing when feelings of guilt or inadequacy arose and tracing them back to their source. Often, these feelings were remnants of generational expectations, not reflections of personal failure. Establishing boundaries helped me interact with these feelings constructively, turning them into insights rather than burdens. Through reflective analysis, I started to reframe my understanding of family dynamics. My mother's approach, once interpreted as punitive or unfair, became more understandable in the context of her upbringing, societal pressures, and generational conditioning. Rather than seeing my mother solely as a source of judgment, I began to view her as a human being shaped by circumstances, much like myself. This reframing did not eliminate hurt or disappointment, but it allowed for empathy to emerge, creating space for connection and understanding that was previously impossible. I also explored the broader impact of generational inheritance on self-perception. Many of my internalized fears and insecurities were reflections of familial patterns passed down unconsciously. Recognizing these patterns empowered me to choose which behaviors and beliefs to carry forward and which to release. This integration of generational insight created a foundation for conscious personal growth. I began to see my life as a bridge between inherited experiences and self-determined identity, where I could honor lessons learned without perpetuating harmful patterns. Emotional resilience became a central focus during this stage. Resilience, I realized, is not about avoiding pain, but developing the capacity to observe, understand, and respond to it effectively. By consciously reflecting on emotional responses, I cultivated the ability to remain centered despite familial pressures or internalized judgments. Daily reflection, journaling, and mindfulness practices allowed me to track emotional triggers, identify recurring thought patterns, and consciously reframe experiences. Over time, this practice fostered a sense of stability, self-confidence, and preparedness for challenges both internal and relational. A significant part of this process involved revisiting past experiences, not to relive pain, but to extract lessons. I examined moments I had once considered failures, academic setbacks, career missteps, and interpersonal misunderstandings. Through a reflective lens, I recognized that each perceived failure had contributed to growth, resilience, and understanding. Mistakes had taught me problem-solving, patience, and perspective. Reframing these events as lessons rather than condemnations allowed me to reclaim a narrative of competence, progress, and intrinsic value. Self-compassion emerged as a transformative principle. I began to treat myself with the same understanding and patience I would offer a friend facing similar challenges. This involved acknowledging limitations without self-judgment, recognizing effort even when outcomes fell short, and allowing space for growth and imperfection. By cultivating self-compassion, I gradually dismantled internalized narratives of inadequacy and replaced them with affirmations of worth, resilience, and agency. This shift created an emotional environment conducive to healing and sustainable personal growth. Part of my healing process involved contemplating future engagement with my mother and family. With deeper understanding, I realized that any communication would be more productive if it was grounded in clarity, empathy, and self-awareness. I reflected on the necessity of approaching conversations not defensively, but with intentionality. Understanding family patterns allowed me to anticipate reactions, maintain emotional equilibrium, and communicate my perspective while respecting theirs. This preparation was essential for maintaining autonomy and self-worth while navigating complex relational dynamics. It also provided a roadmap for building healthier, more constructive connections moving forward. By the end of this period, I recognized that the pain initiated by the letter had catalyzed a process of profound personal growth. What had begun as shock, confusion, and emotional turmoil evolved into understanding, self-awareness, and resilience. I began to perceive challenges not as threats to my identity, but as opportunities for insight and empowerment. The act of reframing, reflecting, and integrating lessons created a sustainable foundation for emotional stability, self-worth, and conscious decision-making. Through consistent reflection and practice, I experienced an emerging clarity about my value, purpose, and direction. I no longer measured my worth against external judgment or arbitrary standards. Instead, I recognized that personal growth, resilience, and integrity were the true markers of success. This clarity fostered a sense of confidence and agency. Decisions became intentional, guided by insight rather than fear of disapproval. Emotional responses were tempered by understanding rather than impulsivity. In this environment, personal empowerment became not only possible but sustainable. Before initiating dialogue, I focused on emotional preparation. This involved examining residual anger, disappointment, and fear and addressing them through reflection, journaling, and internal dialogue. I reminded myself that the purpose of engagement was not to seek validation, nor to argue, but to communicate with clarity, empathy, and self-awareness. Emotional preparedness allowed me to remain centered, respond intentionally, and avoid repeating patterns of reactive behavior. Through this process, I developed strategies for maintaining boundaries, identifying triggers, recognizing projection, and consciously reframing judgments to prevent internalization. These strategies transformed potential confrontations into opportunities for mutual understanding rather than conflict. A crucial element of reconciliation involved recognizing the depth of family legacy. My mother's behavior, rooted in generational pressures, scarcity, and societal expectation, had been projected onto me. Understanding this legacy enabled me to separate inherited fears from personal failure. I reflected on how my grandmother's guidance had emphasized both acknowledgement of family patterns and conscious deviation from harmful cycles. This dual focus, awareness of history combined with deliberate personal choice, formed the foundation for authentic reconciliation. Through this lens, I realized that engaging with my mother required empathy without surrender, communication without compromise of self-worth, and recognition of shared history without becoming trapped in its limitations. I prepared for interaction. I engaged in deliberate internal dialogue. Questions I considered included what I need to communicate for my own clarity and growth, which emotions need acknowledgement, and which require release. How can I maintain perspective while expressing my experience honestly? What boundaries must I uphold to preserve emotional safety? This internal reflection created an internal roadmap. Before initiating dialogue, I focused on emotional preparation. This involved examining residual anger, disappointment, and fear and addressing them through reflection, journaling, and internal dialogue. I reminded myself that the purpose of engagement was not to seek validation, nor to argue, but to communicate with clarity, empathy, and self-awareness. Emotional preparedness allowed me to remain centered, respond intentionally, and avoid repeating patterns of reactive behavior. Through this process, I developed strategies for maintaining boundaries, identifying triggers, recognizing projection, and consciously reframing judgments to prevent internalization. These strategies transformed potential confrontations into opportunities for mutual understanding rather than conflict. A crucial element of reconciliation involved recognizing the depth of family legacy. My mother's behavior, rooted in generational pressures, scarcity, and societal expectation, had been projected onto me. Understanding this legacy enabled me to separate inherited fears from personal failure. I reflected on how my grandmother's guidance had emphasized both acknowledgement of family patterns and conscious deviation from harmful cycles. This dual focus, awareness of history combined with deliberate personal choice, formed the foundation for authentic reconciliation. Through this lens, I realized that engaging with my mother required empathy without surrender, communication without compromise of self-worth, and recognition of shared history without becoming trapped in its limitations. I prepared for interaction. I engaged in deliberate internal dialogue. Questions I considered included what I need to communicate for my own clarity and growth, which emotions need acknowledgement, and which require release. How can I maintain perspective while expressing my experience honestly? What boundaries must I uphold to preserve emotional safety? This internal reflection created an internal roadmap. Forgiveness emerged as a complex, deliberate act. It was not about condoning past actions, nor erasing pain, but about freeing myself from the burden of resentment and internalized negativity. I reflected on the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. Forgiveness involves acknowledgement of reality, understanding of context, and conscious release of the emotional weight associated with hurt. Forgetting is neither necessary nor always possible. Instead, integration of experience allows growth without ongoing suffering. Through this approach, I practiced forgiving my mother for the impact of her letter, her rigid expectations, and past judgments. This did not imply approval of her methods, but it allowed me to reclaim agency over my emotions and redefine my relationship with my own history. Engaging in reconciliation revealed the emotional complexity of familial relationships. It required patience, deep listening, and willingness to encounter discomfort without defensiveness. I reflected on potential challenges, my mother's defensiveness, lingering miscommunications, or the reinforcement of past patterns. By anticipating these possibilities, I cultivated emotional resilience, enabling me to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. This preparation reinforced the importance of conscious interaction. By remaining grounded in self-awareness, I could navigate the conversation with clarity, preserve my emotional stability, and foster constructive dialogue. The actual engagement, when it occurred, was less dramatic than anticipated. It was grounded in honesty, empathy, and intentional communication. I expressed my reflections, acknowledged the challenges of generational patterns, and shared my understanding of my own worth. Throughout this dialogue, I noticed subtle shifts. Defensive responses gave way to curiosity, tension transformed into reflection, and judgment softened into acknowledgement. The interaction became less about proving oneself and more about mutual understanding. This experience reinforced a critical principle. Personal growth is inseparable from relational awareness. By cultivating self-awareness and emotional resilience, interactions that once felt threatening became opportunities for connection and shared insight. By the time I reached this final stage of the journey, a profound sense of clarity had begun to take root. The $347,000 letter, once a symbol of judgment and despair, had evolved into a mirror reflecting both personal growth and the complex dynamics of family, expectation, and resilience. The previous 5 parts of this journey had guided me from shock to reflection, from confusion to insight, and from emotional turmoil to reconciliation. Part 6, then, became an opportunity to consolidate lessons, envision a future defined by intentionality, and embrace a life guided by self-awareness, emotional maturity, and authentic relationships. Reflection had been central throughout this journey. By continually examining my thoughts, emotions, and responses, I had developed a deeper understanding of myself and my place within the family system. In this stage, reflection transformed from analysis to integration. I looked back over my life, acknowledging moments of both struggle and growth, recognizing patterns without judgment, and synthesizing insights into principles for living. Reflection revealed that my life was not a ledger of failures quantified by a parent's expectations, but a dynamic narrative of resilience, learning, and evolution. It highlighted how challenges, both internal and external, had contributed to my development, shaping me into a more self-aware, empathetic, and capable individual. That a central theme of Part 6 was the integration of self-worth into everyday life. Previously, I had struggled with the weight of external judgment, measuring my value through the lens of my mother's expectations. Through the reflective process, guided by Grandma and my own introspection, I began to internalize the understanding that self-worth is intrinsic and non-negotiable. This integration involved daily practices, affirming personal achievements without comparison, recognizing effort as valuable regardless of outcomes, separating emotional well-being from external approval. Forgiveness, both for my mother and for myself, was an essential element of this final stage. Forgiving my mother meant releasing the weight of resentment and recognizing the limitations of inherited patterns. Forgiving myself meant accepting past mistakes without self-condemnation, valuing effort over perfection, and honoring the learning process inherent in every experience. Forgiveness did not erase memory or invalidate experience. Rather, it transformed emotional energy, allowing it to be directed toward growth, understanding, and constructive action. The journey from the initial shock of the $347,000 letter to the consolidation of personal growth spanned months of reflection, dialogue, and introspection. What began as an external judgment became an internal roadmap for resilience, self-worth, and relational harmony. The letter, once a source of anxiety and doubt, had transformed into a catalyst for understanding of self, family, and the patterns that shape human experience. It prompted examination, reflection, and ultimately, the creation of a life informed by insight rather than fear.